Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first podcast. We're going to call it 40 Years Gatherings with Cary Schwarz. And today I've got none other than my number one son here on this very first episode. So TJ Schwarz, he's 28 years of age and been self-employed for pretty much his entire adult life in one form or another. And so he has some thoughts and contributions, I think, for his journey and how things unfolded for him, some of the stub toes and some of the successes that he's had. So welcome to the show, TJ.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to this. I'm excited to keep up with your future series here as you bring in some awesome guests. So pretty lucky to be the first one. I guess I know somebody, huh?
Well, that's it. And of course, all of you haven't heard all the banter that we've been going back and forth to TJ dragging his old dad into the 21st century with all this new technology and so on and so forth. And sitting here with a very fancy microphone and headset and stuff, I feel like I'm Rush Limbaugh or something like that, launching off into the world of entertainment. Infotainment, I guess, is what we would call this. So anyway,
yep, JRE, watch out, huh?
Exactly. Why don't you just give us a quick rundown of your bio information, what you do, and so on and so forth, and some of the things that have brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, grew up Salmon, Idaho, for the listener out there, a little small town, just kind of eastern but central Idaho, and near the Montana border, tiny little town, and went outdoors, did a lot of hunting, enjoyed all that good stuff. Moved to Boise when I graduated high school, and I was going to school there for mechanical engineering, and kind of had a situation where I got really into doing pencil art, and it kind of all revolved around the automobile. I really liked classic cars, was drawing classic cars just with all my free time, essentially starting in high school and then into college. And I was in an engineering class where we were learning this program called SolidWorks, which is a 3D modeling software. So it's like an engineering grade thing where you would, any engineering firm or any company that's manufacturing, they're going to take an idea and turn it into a 3D model before they make it, right? Before it's manufactured. And so I was learning that, and a friend of mine, Bill Koenig, also from Salmon, asked me, he's like, "Hey, you want to design me a knife?" So was really into knives, and he was thought he wanted to start a knife company. So I used that SolidWorks skill that I was kind of developing in that first semester of that engineering course, and kind of fell in love with the knife industry and fell in love with SolidWorks as a program and as a medium for art, and kind of realized in my second year of college that this is what I wanted to do full time, and I wanted to be self-employed, and I realized that having a degree probably didn't matter in the self-employed space, and I would just put my mind to learning on my own. So I left school, and full-time knife industry ever since. That would have been 2014. So 10 years here in the next month since I started sketching my first knife design, and 8 years full-time. And since just been a designer for other companies, and then the last couple of years became more of a custom maker and a manufacturer in my own right, actually having machines and tooling to do it myself.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey. I liken it to you show up at a sporting event, say your kid's in Little League baseball, and you hope that he doesn't trip over third base. So thankfully you never did trip over third base. You may have fallen down maybe a time or two along the way, but been a fun journey to sit
I guess
back
if you hit it
watch.
Far enough, you got enough time to trip a couple times.
There you go. That's true story. So anyway, one of the things I want to bring some relevance to what we have at hand here, of course, is mainly leather workers, saddle makers, and that sort of thing. So, but there's some commonality, I think, with your journey and what most people encounter along the way. And I get the question fairly frequently, well, what advice do you have for me? I'm trying to get going. I've got this day job. I'm trying to figure out whether it's time to jump off the wagon and off into some uncharted territory, and it's a little scary and all of that kind of stuff. Of course, I made that leap when I was young and foolish, and so I, I'm, I never even thought twice about it. Looking back now, it was pretty. Yeah, there was some risk involved there. Certainly a calculated risk, um, but I think one of the elements that I'd like to share with people is the fact that somewhere along the way, I think there has to be some kind of subsidy. And I know you spoke about different income streams, different sources of income as you were trying to get traction moving forward. Can you share some of your experience with some of that?
Yeah, for sure. So uh, I think in the modern era, there's so many ways to make money, even in the narrow field of, like, say, knife design or knife making or the knife industry. There's just a lot of ways to come at it, and some of the big picture goals I had, and like right now I own a couple CNC mills and I make knives, and it's kind of an expensive proposition to do that. So it wasn't accessible to me in the beginning, and so I had to find ways to make money that kind of built towards the bigger picture, but they were in the end they were peripheral goals that just kind of carried me. And the phrase you used to describe it is kind of like a subsidy, because it's like you need to subsidize the main goal if the main goal is a long-term profitability scenario. And so I think with self-employment, it's critical to think that, well, let's say you are in a position where you got a day job and you want to quit, you want to be self-employed, but you can't, pay your bills tomorrow with a brand new business. I think if there's things that you imagine doing, that you could imagine being profitable, but it's going to take a long time, think of the peripheral things that I guess would float the gap, that may not be the ultimate goal, but that produce the clientele, the network, and the skills needed to achieve the ultimate goal. And so for me, it was like part of it was designing knives for other companies. The way the knife industry works, when you go into Cabela's or Sportsman's Warehouse, if you look at a lot of those sporting knives, those or folding pocket knives and whatnot, a lot of them are designed by freelance guys. So I've likened it to the knife or to the music industry before. It's kind of like these knife companies. Some of them are almost like record labels, you could say. And then you have knife makers and designers who are submitting designs to them on a yearly basis. And they're manufacturing knives that they are licensing from freelance guys. And in a sense, I mean, at the end of the day, they're just paying a royalty to the makers for the licensing of those designs. And so that was kind of the first angle of attack for me to come into the industry. And it's not the most hands-on thing because I'm not making the knives, but I'm designing the knives. And the first bulk of my career was doing stuff like that, where it was like I had had the CAD ability, and I think the familiarity with how to design a knife, but not the cash to launch myself into becoming a knife company. So it was like I spent a good 6 or 7 years learning the industry as a freelancer, sort of without spending the big cash on the facilities myself, just sort of learning and developing and making money at the same time, because you got to do that.
I think the main point here for folks out there considering they're serious craftsmen and considering jumping off in that wagon into full-time employment is it's scary, but oftentimes I encounter this all the time. People want to become a saddle maker, so they kind of that's kind of the ultimate goal is to become a saddle maker. And so I guess the point that I would like to make is that, and this dovetails with what you just said, TJ, is that keep that in mind, but try to try to make some plan, a path to get there. And just jumping off into deep water and I'm a saddle maker, that's a pretty tall order. That's pretty tough. pretty tough to do. And rarely it seems like do I encounter somebody, oh, I want to just become a leather craftsman. I just want to start out small and master small techniques. It seems like people are a little bit too impatient. They want to jump off into the big kahuna, the big goal of building saddles, when in fact we probably need to get realistic about our day-to-day goals and start building a path. And building that path is try to develop some different income streams that, say, in accessory items or perhaps working for someone else, to where that ultimate goal could be had at some point along the way. And saddles are pretty demanding.
So you're building a pyramid.
Exactly.
It's better to build a pyramid than a spire.
Exactly. That's a good analogy. I think that so self-employment, it's kind of the American dream, but it's not exactly and you spoke about this too. Maybe you could speak to how that works from a cash flow standpoint and that sort of thing. You talked about, I think you called it self-employment inflation, I think, to coin a term. And so we can pivot into how does that work with regard to what can you expect income-wise out of your endeavors?
Yeah. The cash flow conversation around self-employment, I feel like it's not talked about in a lot of detail. I don't know if it's insecurity or what, but like a lot of times you hear about kind of bigger picture stuff, but when you get down to the nitty gritty of like, okay, paying bills, making money, how much money do you really need to make? One of the things that I like to alert people to if I feel like they're probing about the possibility of being self-employed is what you mentioned that I had talked about previously was self-employment inflation is what I call it. And that means the second, in my opinion, in my view, the second you become self-employed, the dollar, the US dollar or whatever currency you have in your country, it immediately deflates or inflates, I guess would be the correct word, when you become self-employed. And what I mean by that is X amount of income when you're on a salary system, like if you're employed, is worth less or worth more than that same amount of income when you're self-employed, because when you can't I guess forecast like on a 2-week bi-weekly or monthly basis exactly what your income is going to be, you have to spend more conservatively. So the lifestyle of someone, let's say, I'm just going to throw out a round number. Let's say someone's making 6 figures at a job where they're drawing a salary. If someone's making 6 figures self-employed, they have to live a lifestyle and have an array of spending habits that are much lower than the person who's employed, because the stability is in question enough and there's enough fluctuation that from a security standpoint, you're not able to live at the same means level as someone with 100,000. And at 100,000, that becomes, well, who cares? That's a lot of money or whatever. But if you're just trying to get in through the door and you think, well, I need X amount just to pay my bills, you might think about adding 30% to that, 40% to that for your mental picture and your goal of what kind of cash flow needs to happen, because that exchange rate between self-employed dollars and employed dollars, it just isn't equivalent. And I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely does. And to me, there's an undeniable cultural divide between wage earners and the self-employed, such as you and I. I don't think for the most part the wage earners I've known, and of course vast majority of the people I know in this world, friends, family, and so on and so forth, are wage earners. So they really don't have a concept of what it takes to become self-employed. And when it comes to the dollars and cents side of the equation, there's so many factors. I know that your mother, my wife, she's been a government employee for part-time government employee here for a few years, and you take a look at the benefits package that she has, which of course includes health insurance, vacation, all of that kind of stuff. Well, that dollar a figure often will match the actual cash base of her salary. So a lot of people don't realize just what kind of when you got bennies like that as part of your wages, you never see that in your bank account. But that's very much a tangible benefit and a dollar that can be quantified by a dollar figure. So
Yeah.
when you say working for $100 an hour, for most people, they equate that to, as a wage earner, $100 an hour, an 8-hour day, you're making $800 a day. That's an astonishing amount, but they don't often understand, like I said, this cultural divide that exists between wage earners and self-employed. You put the entirety of that gross figure in your pocket, and then you start dispersing expenses, and pretty quick that what may have been a big figure to begin with is gets whittled down. The other part of it too is you've found out too, is the number of billable hours in a day's time is sometimes astonishingly low. So it could be $100 an hour, but you may have been taking up space in your shop for 8 hours, 10 hours, or whatever, but your billable hours that you actually are able to make money at can be quite a bit less than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, self-employment inflation, like I said, I think just to cap that concept off, I just would say that if you're interested and excited about self-employment, which I think you should be, I love self-employment. I think I should preface this whole conversation with that. I love it. I think it's a fit for a lot of people, maybe not everybody. It's maybe some people wouldn't enjoy it that much, but I sure do. And if you did want to do that, if you're trying to replace a day job income, like if we're going to frame it that way, that you want to quit a job and replace that income, just set up your business so that to replace that income, your actual income is going to need to be like 30-40% more than what your day job is, just for it to be equivalent without like a decline in your lifestyle, if that makes sense. Just set that expectation out the gate, and I think it'll serve you well. Because one thing's for sure, with goal setting, with revenue and stuff, that's going to trickle down to things like pricing. It's going to trickle down to things like expenditure, and just like how many hours you work and stuff. And so all those things, if your overall revenue goals are too low, and are perhaps misguided, then all those other things can be affected, and you can have a rough time when, a couple of years later you then start to feel that self-employment inflation. And it could have been avoided with the right pricing model, with the right structure, with the right whatever, from the beginning.
Certainly a lot of planets have to line up in order to become self-employed. So nowadays, we see it certainly in my business years and years ago, why somebody like me would show up at a big shop and with his lunch bucket and clock in and would have nothing else to worry about in a working day but producing a product, whatever it may be. And nowadays you got all these different hats to wear. And just talking to Wilson Capron earlier today and about hiring an accountant, a bookkeeper, just a month-to-month bookkeeper. And I've never done that, but it may well be the right thing, which also brings up another point. I know you've spoken often about outsourcing different aspects of your business and look for professionals to do certain things rather than you wearing all of the hats that could be worn. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I think in the modern era, particularly, I think it's really easy to get spread thin, because you're kind of tasked with making the product you're selling, whether it's a physical product or a service or whatever. The actual deliverable is kind of one of your jobs, and then you've got all the classic stuff, like the bookkeeping and the doing the taxes and sweeping the floors, all the stuff that's always been the case. And then in the modern era, like I said, you've got new things. So you're kind of tasked with being a content creator. sometimes. It's pretty hard to run a business these days without some kind of presence in media, whether it's social media or YouTube or whatever. So that's like a new job that's layered in there. And so eventually you got to start picking and choosing your battles. And when it comes to supporting yourself and kind of making your hours go the furthest, I think it's critical that you double or triple down on the things that you're good at, that you do well, and then pay people that are doing the same thing and in their craft to help you out. So like in the case of an accountant or a CPA, they are doing exactly what you're doing, but they're in their own field of work. And if they're willing to offer those services to you, that takes something off of your plate and allows you to then sell more of your services to the next person doing what you're specialized in doing. And I think specialization it used to be more common and easier, and now we get pretty spread thin. And I think it's still a necessity, and it's still something to strive for, and that's to get really good at what you do, and not get too many irons in the fire, and focus on the main goal. And then if there's things that are distracting you from that, like different businesses have different requirements, but if bookkeeping is one of those things, then it's probably smart to get someone to help you out. But on the other hand, in the early days, that's where you hear these stories of the self-employment 60-hour, 80-hour, 100-hour work week that you sometimes hear fabled. Those are guys having to do their bookkeeping. They can't afford to hire guys, but you can't do that forever, I think, is the ultimate story. You gotta delegate someday.
You describe my life. Anybody, I think, who's ambitious, and then you stack some creativity on top of that, it makes it very tempting. Oh, I can do that, which you probably can. There's a lot of things that you can do, but the question is it something you should do? And start to sort out those things, and you're way ahead to hire a professional, and it's done right. And rather than limping along with a system that's not running as efficiently as it could be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, any other thoughts?
Go
ahead.
We had a conversation on the phone yesterday that I thought was kind of interesting, that could be valuable to some. And that is another thing about the cash flow management, while we're on that topic, is I've likened it to, as your business grows, and it depends on the type of business, but I think a lot of the types of business people that might listen to this would be in this category. But as you have a cash flow growth happening, what I've noticed is it starts to feel like water. And what I mean by that is, like, the income in the very beginning, it's like, I'm going to make this one thing, I'm going to sell it, and you see each chunk of incoming cash as like a singular item. But as a business grows and develops and becomes a real full-fledged business, instead of seeing individual sums of money coming in, it starts to seem like a flow. And that's where you get the phrase cash flow. Is once you start to get a macro view of your business, it seems more like water coming in. And that's what the money is things are happening. You're churning out whatever product or service, and the money's coming in, and you're having to divert this cash flow in ways that make sense. And so I've likened it to irrigation. It's like water's coming. It's not trucks delivering water that you can count. In the early days, it feels like that, but then it starts to turn into more of like a stream. And you have to learn like diversion tactics. It's like you've got reservoirs, you've got places where you need to dam it up, and you're going to flood irrigate, but that's not efficient. Like the whole metaphor of irrigation, I really like with regard to cash flow, because I think many will feel that moment in their business where it stops feeling like chunks of money and starts to feel like a flow. And I think when you start to sense that, it's a moment where there's a transition happening in your perspective. And then it also requires a little bit of a transition in the way you think, because if you're looking at things in terms of like chunks of money, it's easy to get tempted into the mindset of like, I'm going to sell this saddle or whatever, and I'm going to get the money, I'm going to pay the mortgage, and then I'm going to take it and buy leather. And you start to kind of look at these sums of money as like individually allocatable, if that makes sense. But as your business grows and becomes more mature, you start to look at things in a macro level of like this, where you start talking more like percentages. Like this is the percentage of my income that needs to come to me. This is the bottom line I have to hit to make my bills. This is the percentage that is probably smart to reinvest in the business. This is the percentage that needs to go to taxes. And you start thinking more almost in that, like I said, kind of percentage world. And I think it's a powerful change that happens that I'm starting to experience.
Well, a big part of your journey has been trying to sort out those items which have been profitable and some you've had to let go of, some of those income streams you've had to let go of because they simply weren't chinning the bar when it comes to profitability. Uh, Maybe you can talk a little bit about your thoughts on how do we craft a plan forward with an eye towards profitability. I know a part of that is the wholesale retail kind of, is it, do we need to consider wholesale retail, and how does pricing enter that picture?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is a good lead in talking about the kind of irrigation metaphor and the cash flow scenario. Is like if you have a certain amount of water coming in, it's like if you want to sell a product to a retailer, that's fine and good. That's a quality business model, but the pricing model has to reflect that. The amount of revenue has to be able to be divisible, and the phrase that I've heard and that I use is it's called profit centers. So if you have a product that is sold, any product you buy, you can count the profit centers in between the sale of that product and when it was raw materials, essentially. So what I mean by that is, like, if I make a knife, I'm a profit center. I am a group, even though it's just me, that's trying to make money off of making the knife. If I sell it to a retailer, they are a profit center, right? So there's two profit centers. Now, let's say I grow and grow and grow and I need to hire a manufacturer, so I'm no longer going to make it. So now I've got the manufacturer that's a profit center. I'm a profit center. The retailer's a profit center. And the more profit centers you have, then the higher the price has to be. And you can lose competitive advantage when you have too many profit centers within a product. And so, for example, with a saddle, it's less industrious to be like a custom saddle maker. We're not talking about supply chain per se. But for example, with you have your trees made down in New Zealand. And so he's a profit center that is inside of your model. So there's more than one profit center. You've got Herman Oak, you know what I mean? And so that's where you hear people like decide to make their own trees. And you have to decide. I'm not saying that that's what you should do. I'm saying counting the profit centers involved is important, and knowing how to price your stuff is first. You have to know how many profit centers and who's trying to make what, if that makes sense. And does it make sense to have fewer or more profit centers? Will the market bear, for example, if you have a lot of profit centers, the market may not bear the net price that all adds up to, and someone doing everything in house may be more competitive. And so for me, I've done a little bit of retailer selling, but recently I've really tried to chase the dream of being all direct to consumer, because a retailer is a profit center that, if you can get enough audience by being present on social media, YouTube, etc., and with having a good enough product, you can sell direct to customer and cut out that profit center. And so that all goes into pricing, And so if I price a product without enough margin to ever pay a retailer, let's say it's just too low to have them inside also making their money, then that'll never be an option for me, but I will be more competitive than those that are selling to retailers. But the downside is, if I don't have the audience, I won't be able to afford to sell it to a retailer without raising the price, which can rub people wrong too. So it's like a lot of forethought is good to look into margins.
On I guess we'd say the manufacturing side of things, there has to be a certain amount of efficiency built into your system in order to get that profit margin to where it needs to be, so that you can absorb there's enough efficiency that you're making money if you were to sell wholesale. There has to be enough profit margin in that. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit. With yours, of course, you've got a certain amount of automation as a part of that.
Yeah. The more efficient you are, the more profitable you are, and the better chance you stand at affording another profit center inside of your chain. Again, like if I set out and I design a knife and I get really efficient at making it, and I have automation in my process. I've got 2 CNC mills, so they are CNC automated machines that help me be efficient and repeatable and have very high quality with the knives that I make. And so in some ways that gives me the ability to be efficient enough that at a competitive price point, I could theoretically afford to sell these knives to retailers. But I don't want to do that until I sell through the audience that I already have. But having the ability to sell to retailers is important. So having the price be high enough, but also the efficiency be good enough as well. And so, managing the margin kind of balance sheet is a very multifaceted thing, and it involves how efficient you are, like you said, and how many people are making money in this pie.
I know people are
including
probably
the IRS.
Yeah, you got to have enough to pay your taxes as well as part of that. One of the diversions in your irrigation system is to be able to pay your taxes at the end of the year. So I know people are probably wondering, well, how is this all relevant to a leather business or a saddle business? And I know that how would automation possibly how would that enter the picture when it comes to craftsmanship and that sort of thing? And but nowadays, I've had this clicker, which is not a new invention, but it's a hydraulic press to cut out parts of smaller items. I don't use it enough to really justify owning it, but something like that, I think for a leather worker, get some dies made and be able to. I know I just cut some headstall cheek pieces out here just a couple of days ago, and turned on my phase converter. It's a 3-phase power piece of equipment, and so I turned on my phase converter, looked at the clock, and then looked at it again when I turned the phase converter off. I think I cut out 8 different cheek pieces. Let's see. Yeah, 8. It was 2 cheek pieces per headstall, and took me 3 minutes. And I thought to myself, now, if I were cutting these out by hand, tracing it around a pattern and cutting and so on and so forth, wow, that would have taken me, I don't know how long, 30, 40 minutes maybe, I don't know. But time is money nowadays. So something like that is something I would encourage people to take a look at, some of those kinds of automation. People might be shocked to hear that come out of my mouth because I'm this kind of one-off craftsmanship kind of a guy. But my point is, I guess, that we need to start at home base, and then you give it a swing and you go to first base and then to second base. And this whole business of being self-employed takes a certain amount of planning and a very process-oriented mentality in order to get to where you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's absolutely right. Yeah,
anyway.
A phrase that I've been circling around this topic for a long time, but only recently did I come up with a phrase that I think really kind of nails it down. And that phrase is, the process is the product. And it's kind of become my moniker, like in my own head, and something I've started to tell people as well. But sounds a little heady, sounds a little abstract, but it's an extremely literal phrase. And what I think people can be served well by realizing is that when someone buys a saddle from Cary Schwarz, they're buying a piece of you, and you've heard that in the craftsmanship scene, right? People say, you're buying into a maker, and what you're really buying is a piece of their process, and so your process for floral design, your process for making a saddle, for carving a seat, and fitting all these, elements that go into a saddle, hand sewing and whatnot. They're buying a piece of that process from you, and it's shaped like a saddle, but what they're buying is the process itself. And if you need any evidence of this, I would say, imagine if you had a Cary Schwarz saddle and you had a clone of it that was identical in every way, but you didn't make it. Could it sell for the same amount? Let's say it was made 100% by, like, I don't know, a robot or something. It was just, let's say it was like cloned into existence. No one would pay as much, because what that indicates is that they're wanting to buy a piece of your process, and if they know that it wasn't a piece of your process, it's worth less to them. And so that is a piece of evidence, I would say, that the process is in fact the actual product. Um, and it goes all the way from craftsmanship, like I just mentioned, all the way up to in a manufacturing setting, right? The process that you create, let's say you're Henry Ford, right? He is kind of credited with pioneering the automotive boom in the early 20th century. He didn't invent the automobile, right? The Model T was not the product. The assembly line was the product. And you can read into Henry Ford, and he's mainly credited with his primary innovation being the assembly line. And it was this assembly line that made his product valuable, and the Model T was simply what was resultant of his actual product. And so, like, when World War II rolled around, the federal government called him up and said, "We need bombers, we need fighters, we need tanks." And he is selling the same product to them that he was selling to the general public, but it was shaped differently. And so it was shaped like an airplane instead of a Model T. And so his assembly line was the product. And your process of hand sewing, floral design, using a clicker when necessary, it's the product itself. And I think that's where, in this modern era with social media, when you display the backstory, what it is that you do, not just the end result, not the saddle itself, but as people who follow you have seen, all these things that go into it, that's the thing that makes them want to buy what it is, right? And so I think if you come into starting a business with a process oriented mentality and think about building the best process possible, then a good product that's affordable, that people want, will be a byproduct of that.
Well, you used the word story there a moment ago, and that cannot be overstated. I think the two-stage process of what we're talking about right here. You got that process, which is the actual making of the thing that we do, and secondly is being able to be visible and tell the story of that process so that you get people to buy in. And and that can often be done with, as we see on social media, especially websites and so on and so forth, is an emotional connection that people make to images, and you get people that buy in, they subscribe to this ethos, this idea that you're trying to get across. And I guess my part of my point, though, is part of your process. Don't be afraid of a certain amount of automation in order to widen that margin of profit, so that you're not standing there at your bench and you're cutting for hours and hours and hours, putting together a batch of whatever it may be, head stalls or breast collars or notebook covers or whatever. And we need to, I guess another way of saying it, within your process, it needs to be, we need to work smarter and not just harder at it. And I think the days when, you just have to put in more hours, well, there's only so many of us, and in our day and time, there's, as we said there earlier in this conversation, that our time is very easily divided up in a lot of different ways. So we need to get dialed into those things that are going to, that we're the best, that we are most competent at and most capable at, and that's likely where our margin of profit is going to lie, somewhere in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And another way to drive that home a little bit is I've heard this phrase before, and it's the phrase is, you will always fall to the level of your process. So no matter how motivated you are, no matter how many hours in a day you work, no matter how much time you have, no matter how much you neglect all other aspects of your life, no matter what you put in from a man hours perspective, you will always fall to the level of your process. If your process has problems, then your business is going to have problems. Your output's going to have problems. Your products are going to have blemishes. They're not going to be as good as they could possibly be. And you just have to have your process be the foundation and the bedrock. And it's the business is not about the product, in that it's, I would argue, like, your business is not about the saddle. It's about the process of making the saddle. And you've been a testament to the fact that if you slave over making that process as perfect and repeatable as possible, and creative in your case as possible, then the saddles will speak for themselves. They'll represent that process, and then you have something, right? Then you have a business.
All of this stuff, I'm sure, to the young person trying to get going in the leather business, saddle business, so on and so forth, sounds kind of heady and perhaps even out of reach. But I don't know what to say about that, because there's so many planets that have to line up in order for a person to be successful at it. I know I've listed a number of times, you have to have pricing figured out. You got to have efficiency figured out. Part of that process we were talking about. You've got to have access to a clientele that's willing to pay you for what you're worth there. And what was the other thing? Pricing, efficiency, and so efficiency, of course, part of that is time management, and quality, of course, is part of that. So those four things. And if you drop the ball on any one of those things, your business is likely going to be in jeopardy. And that's where I think I'll say it again, where if there's some sort of income stream, a revenue stream that is accessible, that perhaps could be an aspect of that, could be automation, could be a part of it, it's outsourced. Maybe there's something that someone else could do more efficiently than you, but it's got your name on it. Those are some thoughts I have as far as advising a young person on how am I going to get going here. There's nothing like having an income stream that's reliable, especially as you get started out. And that's where I think you've had that, you've encountered that. You've had reliable income streams, and then you, at some point, you built up the confidence to offload some of those in order to for a little bit bigger slices of pie, as it were.
Yeah. And again, using that phrase, the process is the product. You have to think about, let's say you do have a day job, you have skill in leatherworking or knife making or whatever art or craft or service that you are, interested in. Let's say you have a level of skill, and you're trying to set out and use it. Well, think about what product you have to sell. And it's easy. Let's say you are a leather worker and you can conceivably make a saddle, and you have made a saddle. That doesn't mean that a saddle is a product that you actually have the ability to sell, because if you spent X number of months or years to build that saddle, it wouldn't be profitable. And it's pretty easy to see that if that's the situation you're in. So what product do you have to sell? And I think people often, when they hear that, they think, okay, the product, and they're thinking about a physical object like a saddle or reins or tack or saddlebags. They're thinking about physical objects when they think, what do I have to sell? But I would try to reorient your mindset on, no, what processes do you have to sell? And that's getting to what you're pointing to. Like, let's say you do have a clicker, or let's say all you have is a round knife. Let's say you do have a sewing machine. Let's say you do have a hole punch and something for punching grommets, or like, look at the tools that you have in front of you and think about, what is that combined into a saleable item? What is it? You know what I mean? And if a saddle is not it, maybe you should be selling the product that you already have to start with, and again, working up towards that saddle. And so I think the exercise of writing down the processes that you have mastered, even if it's only like two, and then figure out how can you sell that. Let's say it is only running a sewing machine. Let's say you're really, really good at running your harness stitcher, well, what items in the world are of value and of interest to people, where the main value proposition is the stitching itself, and that's where the creativity comes in, of thinking of a product like that. Like, let's say you can cut something out and you can stitch it well. What is that product? And so an example in my life of where that came in is like when I started out and I was designing knives for large companies and whatnot, and I wanted to make my own stuff. I wanted to make my own products, and I still couldn't afford a real shop to make knives in an efficient way. Now, I could have made knives, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to make knives in a way that would be profitable because I didn't have the resources to do so. And so what I decided to do was I looked around me and I thought, I've got you, my dad, who's got a clicker. I've got a friend in Boise who owns a laser cutter that can cut any kind of steel or material. And I know a little bit about working with leather from growing up in your shop, and a little bit about finishing metal. But I don't really have the way to put bevels and sharpen and heat treat on a knife. But I looked at what I did have access to and I could do reliably. And I thought, what is that? And I came up with the idea that it could be theoretically a comb. And so what it was a leather sheathed folding comb, and the comb was laser cut brass, and it would fold into a leather loop that that I was having you cut out on the clicker to supply to me. And it became a bedrock product for my business for several years, and ended up being one of those subsidies on my path to becoming a knife manufacturer. And I wasn't setting out in this industry to be a comb maker. I was setting out to build some sort of ability to manufacture. And what the processes that I had that I could theoretically sell did not amount to a finished knife. And so I found what those actually did amount to, and then found a way to sell it. And so I think aiming too high too early is where you can get into possibly some trouble. And once again, the process is the product. So figure out what processes you have and how to sell it. And if you don't have enough processes to make anything at all, then that's the first step, is to find processes,
So what you're saying is the comb, in your instance, was more of a means to an end. It was.
Mm-hmm.
You said
Stepping
you didn't.
stone.
It wasn't. You didn't want to become a famous comb maker. You wanted to. You weren't going to make a fortune selling these combs. But its usefulness wore off after a while. It could be a business you could sell to someone else at some point along the way. But the bottom line, it was a means to an end, a stepping stone.
Correct.
And that's really a lot of what I'm trying to say here. The case that I'm trying to make is that look at stepping stones, find ways where you have, and you used the term here a few minutes ago, that have value proposition. And that's another term that I've heard I learned from you, I don't know, some time back. And can you unpack, what do you mean by value proposition?
Yeah, for sure. So value proposition, I learned from, I designed a knife for a company out of San Francisco big time kind of a tech company, really, and they wanted to get into making some knives. So they contracted me to design a knife for them, and so they had a very Silicon Valley kind of terminology about them, and that's where I picked up on this phrase that I really liked, and that is value proposition. And it's a phrase that's used widely. I've heard it in other places as well, but what it means is when someone looks at a product, the thing that they see that draws them to it, that makes them want to buy it, is where they see the value to be. And you can't it the thing that they see as being valuable may not be the thing that actually costs the most when making it. And so making sure that the energy you're putting into a product aligns well with what people perceive the value to be in the right places is kind of a hard job, but it's critical. And let me give like an example of that. So like for example, with a knife, there's so much labor in a knife that the actual steel, the cost of the steel itself, doesn't really make up hardly any value of the knife. It's almost all labor. And so if you make a small knife, a customer will look at it and say, that is like 40% smaller than your other model. In their head, they may view it as, that looks like it should be 40% less, because that's the way they view the value of that product. But on my side, it takes the same amount of labor to make a small knife as a big knife. And the difference in the steel value is not enough to make a difference in the price, really. And so what does that tell me? That tells me I am better off making bigger knives because my labor will be worth more to them as a value. My proposition of value will align better with what they perceive the value to be than a small knife where they're going to think it should be less money, even though I know it really needs to be the same price, if that makes sense. And so just whatever you're doing, make sure you're thinking about, if I'm spending 40 hours doing something that they don't see as that valuable, and 1 hour doing the thing that they really perceive to be of high value, then you're probably doing something wrong. You know, you may have designed it improperly, or to not align in a good way to be a good value proposition.
That makes perfect sense. That falls under that rubric of working smarter and not just harder. Of course, part of that equation too is trying to get your eyes behind a consumer out there, a person that would come to buy whatever it is you have to offer, and that can be tricky stuff. But to have our eyes open to what is, in the eyes of a consumer, that value proposition as you just defined it there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you get into, again, utilizing what you're good at. So for example, I would argue that with your saddles, one of your primary leading value propositions is the floral carving on those saddles. And so when customers come to you, they perceive the value of your saddles highly because of the floral carving. And you are investing many, many hours into that floral carving. So in other words, the alignment is correct. Their value judgment does match the hours put in. And that's you have a good system, and that's why it's worked for you, and you've built a business largely on that pillar. But if you were doing that and they were seeing the value in that yours had the best fit in the seat, and then all of your time though was on the floral carving, but their value perception was on the fit in the seat. Well, you should be making rough out saddles with that perfect fit and not doing the floral carving anymore, which is not true now for you. But maybe someone could be in that situation where their value proposition to the customer is not aligned with where their time is being spent on the saddles.
Well, that strikes as a whole different discussion for another day, but that combination of function and art. And so for me, as many people come to know, that the art part of it, I've worked pretty hard at it, but it's also been the easiest part for me. It hasn't. I've rarely in my 40 years a saddle maker, is a customer been disappointed with the artwork on it. But the functional aspects of things, that's what'll keep you up at night and trying to figure out. The goalposts are moving all the time, and you're trying to figure this out and that out, and running into all kinds of conflicting information on that. So, but that does highlight, I think, the fact that there are different aspects of value proposition, I think, for people out there. So, well,
you have to know your customer.
Got to know your clientele and target a clientele, and have them in mind. That's one of those 4 components, I think, of trying to stay in business, is gathering a clientele.
Yeah, and let me tack one small little, I guess, actionable kind of like analogy on there. So from a value proposition, one of the ideas I was thinking about is like, let's say you have a little bit of leather skill, a little bit of leather tooling. You want to start a business. Well, let's say you make something like a dog collar, right? It doesn't have very much leather. It's just 10, 12 inches of leather strapping. Doesn't require like an expensive buckle. And you can buy those things on Amazon, some cheap junk leather dog collar. And so the value proposition, or people are going to look at it and say, well, I can buy that on Amazon for $12, right? So how are you going to sell that thing when you don't have the value proposition? Well, what if you can inscribe a name of the dog into the collar? Amazon can't do that, right? And let's say you're going to go and sell it for 30, 50, whatever, however many dollars you have to get out of it. Your 4 or 5 minutes to stamp a name into that collar could be what people are willing to pay another $30 for over Amazon. So the idea is find that angle, that vector, where you can add value proposition without adding a lot of time. And that is kind of a summation of that. And that's just like a small example. Is you can't beat Amazon at what they do. You can't beat like a big manufacturer at what they do if you're a one-man shop. So what's your value proposition? You got to figure that out.
I think that's a good point to make, especially in the custom world, because people wired like me, you look at a project and you don't think about how much time it's going to take. You just want to make it better than the last thing, which is a good model to follow. But some of those little rabbit trails you head off into could have you spending way, way too much time, to where you completely abandoned this concept of value proposition, and that's a way to go broke when you've added so much time into this, but people don't see the value in it. So
yeah.
Well, we're coming up on an hour. That was kind of my goal, was to kind of slog our way through an hour or so. So any other thoughts you might have before we call it a day?
Well, it feels like a champagne bottle on a ship, I might say, the launch of the podcast. So might have to crack a beer after this and see how this all goes. So I hope it works out well for you.
Well, it's been fun, and we've spent hours and hours and hours on the phone. Sometimes I've been under the impression, well, I should have had some kind of a recording device for this. Well, we've got a recording device now, so it's been fun. I appreciate you being on board.
Of course.
We'll call it a day. Take care, everybody.
And see you later.